Hey everyone, and welcome back for another Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling a chapter from Neuroscience for Dummies.
Sounds intimidating, but it's really a great intro to the brain and nervous system.
Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways from this chapter that really stood out to you?
Well, I think the book does a fantastic job of kind of like setting the stage, taking us all the way back to the very beginnings of life on Earth.
Okay, so we're talking billions of years ago. Single-celled organisms.
Exactly. And the point they're making is that even back then, the drive to survive, the need to, find food and avoid danger led to some pretty incredible innovations.
Like, what kind of innovations? I'm picturing those little amoebas with tiny tool belts.
Not quite, but they did develop ways to specialize and communicate, and eventually this led to the emergence of the nervous system.
Okay, so the nervous system is basically a communication network.
Precisely. And it revolutionized life on Earth. It allowed organisms to sense their environment, respond to stimuli, and coordinate their movements.
So we're talking about that leap from just reacting to the environment to actually sensing it and making deliberate movements.
Exactly. And that's a key distinction, right? It's what separates plants, which just kind of sit there, from animals, which can actively explore their world.
So, how did movement actually drive the evolution of the nervous system?
Well, think about it. Organisms that could move in a coordinated way had a huge advantage. They could seek out food more effectively, escape predators, and explore new environments.
That makes sense. I mean, if you can't move, you're pretty much stuck wherever you are.
Exactly. And so natural selection favored those organisms that had more sophisticated nervous systems, allowing for greater control and coordination of movement.
So we owe our brains to our ancient ancestors who just wanted to get around.
In a way, yes. And of course, the human brain is far more complex than those early nervous systems, but the basic principles are still there.
So speaking of the human brain, the chapter also talks about the neocortex, right?
Right? And that's another key milestone in the evolution of the brain. The neocortex is that outermost layer of the brain, and it's responsible for all those higher level cognitive functions that we associate with being human language, planning, decision making, abstract thought.
So the neocortex is what sets us apart from more other animals.
To a large extent, yes. It's much larger and more developed in humans than in any other species.
Okay, so we got this evolutionary foundation. Now let's zoom in on the nervous system itself. What are the main components?
Well, the basic building blocks are neurons and glia. Neurons are those specialized cells that transmit information throughout the nervous system.
Okay, I remember learning about neurons in school. They're those brain cells that send electrical signals, right?
Exactly, and they're incredibly complex and fascinating cells. Each neuron has a cell body, dendrites, and an axon.
So, what do those different parts do?
Well, the dendrites receive signals from other neurons, the cell body processes those signals, and the axon transmits the signals to other neurons, muscles, or glands.
So it's like a chain reaction with each neuron passing the signal along to the next one.
It's more like a complex network, actually, with billions of neurons firing and communicating with each other simultaneously.
Billions. Wow, that's hard to even imagine.
It is, and to make things even more mind-boggling, the book mentions that the average human brain has something like 86 billion neurons.
86 billion. That's more stars than there are in the Milky Way galaxy.
It is pretty amazing, and each neuron can have thousands of connections to the main neurons, forming a network of incredible complexity.
Okay, so how does all that complexity translate into, actual thoughts and behaviors?
Well, the brain isn't just a random jumble of neurons. It's organized into different regions and modules, each responsible for specific functions.
So it's like a well-organized company with different departments handling different tasks.
Precisely. And these modules communicate with each other through those axon tracks, those long fibers that carry signals from one part of the brain to another.
So it's all about teamwork and communication, even at the level of our brains.
Exactly. And the book emphasizes that the brain is constantly adapting and reorganizing itself based on our experiences and interactions with the world.
So our brains are always changing.
They are. That's what allows us to learn new things, form memories, and adapt to new situations.
That's pretty amazing. But what's the ultimate purpose of all this neural activity?
Well, the book highlights movement as kind of the core purpose of the nervous system. It's what distinguishes animals from plants, right?
Right, right. But how does our brain actually make movement happen?
Well, first we need information about the world around us, and that's where sensory neurons come in. They're those specialized neurons that detect stimuli from our environment, light, sound, touch, taste, smell, and send those signals to the brain.
So sensory neurons are like the brain's spies, gathering information from the outside world.
Exactly, and they're incredibly diverse, each type tuned to a specific kind of stimulus. For example, we have photoreceptors in our eyes that detect light, hair cells in our ears that detect sound waves, and chemoreceptors in our nose and tongue that detect chemicals.
So our brains are constantly bombarded with sensory information. What happens to all that information?
Well, it's processed and integrated in different parts of the brain, and that processing leads to the generation of motor commands that are sent back out to the muscles, causing them to contract or relax.
Okay, so it's a loop sensory information in, motor commands out.
Basically, yes, and that loop is what allows us to interact with the world in a meaningful way.
So the chapter also talks about the neocortex being involved in like conscious thought and decision making. How does that fit in?
Well, the neocortex receives input from those sensory systems and then processes that information to generate more complex responses that involve planning, decision-making, and higher-level cognitive functions.
So the neocortex is what allows us to like think about the future, make plans, and solve problems.
Exactly, and it's what allows us to have this conversation right now.
That's pretty incredible. And the book also mentions memory, language, and intelligence. How do those fit into the picture?
Well, those are all incredibly complex functions, and they involve multiple brain regions. But one area that plays a key role in all of them is the frontal lobe, particularly the prefrontal cortex.
I've heard of the prefrontal cortex. It's like the CEO of the brain, right? Making decisions and planning for the future.
That's a good analogy, and it's this part of the brain that's really expanded in humans compared to other animals.
So it's kind of like the key to our humanness.
You could say that. It allows us to do things that no other species can do, like engage in abstract thought, plan for the long term, and control our impulses.
So when I'm trying to like resist that extra slice of cake, it's my prefrontal cortex battling it out with my more primal instincts.
Exactly. And the prefrontal cortex also plays a major role in things like language, memory, and social cognition.
Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is pretty important. But all this talk about brain regions is starting to make my head spin. It's like, where is all this stuff located?
Well, luckily, the book gives us a great tour of the brain. It starts with the four lobes of the neocortex: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe.
Okay, let's start with the front lobe. We already touched on its importance for like planning and decision making. What else is going on in there?
Well, the frontal lobe is also home to the motor cortex, which controls our voluntary movements.
So when I decide to like reach for my coffee cup, it's the motor cortex that sends the signal to my arm muscles.
Exactly. And it's organized in a really interesting way. Different parts of the motor cortex control different parts of the body.
So there's like a map of the body laid out on the motor cortex.
There is, and it's not a proportional map either. The parts of the body that require finer motor control, like our hands and face, have a much larger representation on the motor cortex.
That makes sense. I mean, we use our hands for so many intricate tasks, and our faces are incredibly expressive.
And that distorted map is sometimes depicted as a little man called the homunculus.
The homunculus, isn't that like a creepy little creature from like alchemy or something?
Well, the homunculus in neuroscience is just a visual representation of how the motor cortex is organized. It's a fun way to think about how much brain power is dedicated to different parts of the body.
I like it. Okay, so we've got the motor cortex in the frontal lobe. What about those other lobes? What do they do?
Well, the parietal lobe, which is located behind the frontal lobe, is all about processing sensory information from the body touch, temperature, pain, pressure, and also spatial awareness.
So it's like the brain's sensory integration center.
Exactly. It takes all that input from the body and helps us understand where we are in space and how our body is positioned.
That's pretty important. I mean, I wouldn't want to accidentally walk into a wall because my brain didn't know where my body was.
Exactly. And just like the motor cortex, the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe also has a homunculus representation.
So we've got a motor homunculus and a sensory homunculus. Is there any other homunculi hanging out in our brains?
Not that I know of, but those two homunculi are pretty fascinating, and they really illustrate how the brain dedicates more processing power to those parts of the body that are most sensitive or require finer motor control.
Okay, so we've covered the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. What about the other two lobes?
Well, the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain is the primary visual processing center. It receives input from the eyes and decodes those signals to create the visual world we experience.
So it's like the brain's movie theater, taking in the raw footage from our eyes and turning it into a coherent picture.
That's a great way to think about it, and the occipital lobe is incredibly complex, with different areas specialized for processing different aspects of vision, like color, motion, and depth.
Wow, so it's a whole team of visual experts back there working together to make sense of the world.
Exactly. And last but not least, we have the temporal lobe, which is located beneath the parietal lobe.
Okay, what's the temporal lobe in charge of?
Well, it has a few major roles. First, it's the primary auditory processing center, so it receives input from the ears and helps us make sense of sounds.
So when I'm listening to music, it's my temporal lobe that's allowing me to enjoy the melody and the rhythm.
Exactly. And the temporal lobe is also involved in language comprehension, memory, and object recognition.
So it's a pretty busy lobe?
It is, and it has close connections to the limbic system, which is involved in emotions and motivation.
Okay, so we've covered the four lobes of the neocortex. Is that all there is to the brain? Because I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have. There's a whole other world of fascinating structures beneath the neocortex, known as the subcortical areas.
Subcortical, that sounds kind of mysterious and intriguing.
It is, and it's where we'll pick up in part two of our deep dive.
I can't wait. This deep dive is already blowing my mind. See you in part two.
Welcome back. Last time we kind of left off on a cliffhanger talking about those mysterious subcortical areas.
Right, like the basement of the brain where all the essential wiring and plumbing happens.
That's a great way to think about it. These areas are involved in functions that are often outside of our conscious awareness, but absolutely crucial for survival.
Okay, which subcortical area are we exploring first?
Let's start with the thalamus. It's often described as the gateway to the cortex because it relays and filters sensory information.
From all of our senses?
Almost all of them, yeah. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, you name it. The thalamus makes sure those signals get to the right place in the cortex for processing.
So it's like a grand central station directing traffic from all those sensory inputs.
Exactly. Imagine all those signals coming in from your eyes, ears, skin. The thalamus makes sure they get to the right destination.
That's a pretty important job. What happens if the thalamus gets damaged?
Well, it can lead to problems with sensory processing, attention, even consciousness. The thalamus also plays a key role in regulating sleep and wakefulness.
So it's not just a relay station, it's also involved in higher level functions.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to another fascinating area, the limbic system. It's a collection of structures that play a central role in our emotions, memories, and motivations.
I've heard of the limbic system. It's sometimes called the emotional brain, right?
That's a common nickname. One key structure in the limbic system is the hippocampus. It's essential for forming new memories, especially explicit memories of events and facts.
So the hippocampus is why I can remember, like, my birthday party from last year or the capital of France.
Exactly. And right next to the hippocampus is the amygdala, which is all about processing emotions, particularly fear and aggression.
So the amygdala is why I jump when I hear a loud noise or feel anxious before a big presentation.
That's right. The amygdala is constantly scanning the environment for potential threats, triggering those fight or flight responses. But it's not just about fear, it's also involved in processing positive emotions like pleasure and reward.
Okay, so the hippocampus is forming memories, and the amygdala is attaching emotional significance to those memories.
You got it. They work together to create those emotionally charged memories that can shape our behaviors.
It's amazing how these different brain regions work together to create our experiences.
And we're not done with the limbic system yet. There's also the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in evaluating the emotional significance of stimuli.
So the orbitofrontal cortex helps me decide if that piece of chocolate cake is worth the extra calories, or if I should stick to my diet.
Exactly. It weighs the potential rewards and punishments of different actions, helping us make choices that are in our best interest.
It's like the brain's internal cost-benefit analyst.
That's a great way to think about it. Now, another important structure in the limbic system is the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. It plays a role in monitoring our progress towards goals.
So if I'm trying to solve a puzzle and I get stuck, the ACC is what tells me to try a different approach.
Exactly. It helps us adapt to changing circumstances and stay on track. It's also involved in regulating emotional responses, particularly in social situations.
So the ACC helps us navigate the complex world of social interactions and make sure we don't, like, accidentally offend our boss.
You got it. Now let's move on to a group of structures called the basal ganglia. They're involved in planning, organizing, and executing movements, working closely with the frontal lobes.
So they're like the brain's choreographers, making sure our movements are smooth and coordinated.
That's a perfect analogy. The basal ganglia receive input from the cortex and then send signals back to the cortex via the thalamus to fine-tune those movements.
It's another example of those feedback loops that are so important in brain function.
Absolutely. And the basal ganglia are also involved in learning new motor skills and habits. Think about learning to ride a buff. Those skills become automatic thanks to the basal ganglia.
So when I'm, like, effortlessly typing on my keyboard without even looking at the keys, it's my basal ganglia doing the work.
You got it. And they're also involved in motivation and reward, playing a role in things like addiction.
So those cravings for chocolate or that urge to check social media, are those driven by the basal ganglia?
They play a role, along with other brain areas. It's a complex interplay of factors.
The brain is a truly fascinating organ. What other subcortical areas are we exploring today?
Let's move on to the brainstem. It's the oldest part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking, and it's responsible for those essential life-sustaining functions: breathing, heart rate, temperature regulation.
So it's like the basement where all the vital utilities are located.
That's a great analogy. The brainstem is also the conduit for information passing between the cerebrum, cerebellum, and spinal cord. It's divided into three parts: the midbrain, pons, and medulla.
What are those different parts responsible for?
The medulla controls things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, swallowing, really the control center for those autonomic functions.
So if the medulla gets damaged, it's pretty much game over.
It can be very serious, yeah. The pons is involved in relaying sensory information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It also controls things like sleep, respiration, bladder control, hearing, equilibrium, taste, eye movement, facial expressions, facial sensation, and posture.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibilities for one little part of the brain.
It is. And finally, the midbrain plays a role in motor movement, particularly movements of the eye, and in auditory and visual processing.
So the midbrain is why I can track a moving object with my eyes or turn my head towards a sudden sound.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about the cerebellum. It's often called the little brain because it looks like a smaller version of the cerebrum.
I've heard that the cerebellum is all about balance and coordination. Is that right?
That's a big part of its job. The cerebellum is essential for smooth movements, balance, posture, and motor learning.
So when I'm dancing, playing tennis, or even just walking across the room without tripping over my own feet, I can thank my cerebellum.
Exactly. But here's something that might surprise you. The cerebellum actually has more neurons than the rest of the brain combined.
Wait, really? More neurons than the cerebrum? Why would the cerebellum need so many neurons?
It's a great question. It turns out that the cerebellum is involved in far more than just motor control. Research suggests it plays a role in language, attention, emotional regulation, even social cognition.
So the cerebellum is like the unsung hero of the brain, working behind the scenes.
That's a great way to put it. It's a remarkably complex and adaptable structure.
This is all so fascinating. I'm starting to see how all these brain regions work together to create our experiences.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, there's one more essential structure we need to talk about: the spinal cord.
The spinal cord, I thought that was part of the nervous system, not the brain itself.
It's technically part of the central nervous system, along with the brain, and it plays a vital role in communication between the brain and the body. It's like the information superhighway.
Okay, so it's the main cable connecting the brain to the peripheral nervous system.
Exactly. The spinal cord is organized into segments, each controlling a specific region of the body. It carries sensory information up to the brain and motor commands down to the muscles.
So when I touch something hot and quickly pull my hand away, that signal is traveling from my hand up the spinal cord to the brain and then back down to my muscles to initiate that reflex.
Precisely. But here's the fascinating part. Some reflexes are so fast that they actually bypass the brain altogether.
Wait, what? How is that possible?
It's called a reflex arc. The sensory signal travels to the spinal cord and then directly synapses with a motor neuron, triggering the muscle response before the brain even has time to process what's happening.
So it's like a shortcut, designed for those split-second reactions.
Exactly. Think about that knee-jerk reflex. That's a classic example of a reflex arc.
That's incredible. So the spinal cord is more than just a passive conduit. It's an active processing center capable of making decisions.
Absolutely. It's a remarkably sophisticated system.
Okay, so we've covered the thalamus, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the spinal cord. Is that all the major subcortical areas?
Well, there's one more system we need to talk about: the autonomic nervous system. It's responsible for controlling those involuntary functions that we don't consciously think about: heart rate, digestion, breathing, temperature regulation.
So it's like the behind-the-scenes crew for our internal organs, making sure everything runs smoothly.
That's a perfect analogy. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into two branches: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. They often work in opposition to each other to maintain balance.
So they're like the yin and yang of our internal world.
Exactly. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for that fight-or-flight response. It kicks in when we're faced with a threat, increasing heart rate, blood pressure, respiration.
So it's the system that gets activated when I'm about to give a big presentation or when I'm watching a scary movie.
That's right. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite. It's all about rest and digest. It slows our heart rate, lowers blood pressure, promotes digestion.
So it's the system that's active when I'm like curled up on the couch with a good book or enjoying a delicious meal.
Exactly. And the interplay between these two systems is constantly shifting, depending on our internal state and the demands of the environment.
This is all so fascinating. I'm starting to see how the nervous system is like an orchestra with all these different instruments playing together.
That's a beautiful analogy, and we've only just begun to explore the complexity of this incredible system.
I can't wait to dive deeper. What else is in store for us on this neuroscience journey?
Well, next we'll be shifting gears and exploring how scientists study the brain.
That sounds amazing. I'm ready to learn more. Okay, so last time we left off talking about how the nervous system is like this intricate orchestra with all these different parts working together.
Right, a symphony of biological processes.
Exactly. But now I'm really curious about how scientists actually study the brain. I mean, it seems like it would be so hard to peek inside this incredibly complex organ.
You're right, it's a huge challenge, but over the years, neuroscientists have developed some really ingenious tools and techniques to try to unravel those mysteries.
Okay, so like what are some of the methods they use?
Well, one approach is to study the effects of brain injuries, by observing how damage to specific brain regions affects behavior and cognition. Scientists can start to infer what those regions do.
So it's kind of like a detective trying to solve a crime by looking at the clues left behind.
Exactly. And in the early days of neuroscience, that was one of the primary ways researchers learned about the brain. But as technology advanced, we got more sophisticated tools to study the brain in action.
Like that, what are some of those more modern techniques?
Well, one of the biggest breakthroughs was the development of electroencephalography, or EEG. It involves placing electrodes on the scalp to measure the electrical activity of the brain.
So it's like listening in on the brain's electrical chatter.
That's a great way to put it. EEG can detect these patterns of brain activity associated with different states of consciousness, like sleep and wakefulness. It can also detect different cognitive processes, like attention and memory.
So doctors can use EEG to diagnose things like sleep disorders or epilepsy.
Right, and researchers use it to study how the brain responds to different stimuli, like sounds or images.
That's pretty amazing. But I imagine EEG has some limitations, right? I mean, it's just measuring the activity on the surface of the brain.
Yeah, that's true. EEG provides a broad overview of brain activity, but it doesn't give us much detail about what's happening in specific brain regions deeper down. For that, we need other techniques like microelectrodes.
Microelectrodes, those sound tiny.
They are. These tiny electrodes are inserted directly into the brain, and they allow researchers to record the activity of individual neurons.
Wow, so we can actually eavesdrop on the conversations happening between brain cells.
We can, and that's revolutionized our understanding of how neurons communicate and process information.
I bet that's led to some incredible discoveries.
Oh, absolutely. For example, microelectrode recordings have been crucial in understanding how neurons in the visual cortex respond to different types of visual stimuli, like edges and lines and colors. And they've even been used to help people with paralysis control prosthetic limbs with their thought.
That's mind-blowing. It's like science fiction becoming reality. Are there any other techniques like that?
Another powerful tool is called patch clamp recording. This technique allows researchers to study the flow of ions across the neuron's membrane, which is essential for generating those electrical signals we've been talking about.
So it's like zooming in on the microscopic machinery that makes neurons work.
Exactly. Patch clamp recording has helped us understand how different types of ion channels contribute to neuronal signaling and how those channels are affected by neurotransmitters and drugs.
Okay, so we have EEG for measuring broad brain activities, microelectrodes for listening to individual neurons, and patch clamp recording for studying those ion channels. What about actually seeing what's happening inside the brain? Is that possible?
It is. That's where brain imaging comes in. And one of the most widely used techniques is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI.
I've heard of MRI doctors use it to diagnose all sorts of medical conditions. How does it work exactly?
MRI uses powerful magnets and radio waves to create these detailed images of the brain's structure. It can distinguish between different types of brain tissue, like gray matter and white matter, and it can reveal subtle abnormalities, like tumors or lesions.
So it's like taking a high-resolution snapshot of the brain's anatomy.
Precisely. And then there's another type of MRI called functional MRI, or fMRI, which can actually measure brain activity.
Wow. How does that work?
Well, fMRI relies on the fact that active brain regions need more oxygen and blood flow. So by detecting these changes in blood flow, fMRI can pinpoint which areas of the brain are most active during a particular task or experience.
So if I'm like watching a scary movie, fMRI could show which parts of my brain are lighting up in response to the suspense and fear.
Exactly. fMRI has been a game changer for neuroscience because it allows us to study the neural correlates of all sorts of cognitive processes, from language and memory to emotion and decision-making, in a way that wasn't possible before.
That's incredible. And it's all thanks to the ingenuity of these scientists who've developed these amazing tools for exploring the brain.
It's a really exciting time to be in neuroscience. The discoveries we've made so far are just the tip of the iceberg, and there's still so much we don't know about how this incredible organ works.
This whole deep dive has been absolutely mind-blowing. I feel like I've learned so much, from the brain's evolutionary origins to the intricate details of its structure and function.
Me too. It's amazing to think about all the complexity that's packed into this 3-pound organ inside our heads and how it gives rise to all of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
And I can't wait to see what amazing discoveries are made in the future. Thanks so much for guiding me through this journey into the world of neuroscience.
It's been my pleasure, and to everyone listening, keep those brains buzzing.
And that's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of knowledge.